Clara Whitmore did not cry when her father signed his name. She stood straight, shoulders back, eyes forward, the way her mother taught her before fever took her. The pen scratched across the paper, and just like that, 19 years of her life were traded for a man's debts and a stranger's silence. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The morning her father sold her, Clara Whitmore was standing in the kitchen pulling biscuits from the oven. She heard the voices through the wall, her father's low and urgent, the other man's quiet and flat, and she already knew. Not because she had been warned, because she had been watching her father negotiate everything else in their life down to nothing for 3 years, and she was the last thing left. She set the pan on the counter. She pulled off her oven mitts. She folded them carefully over the edge of the basin, the way her mother always had. Then she walked into the front room. Horace Whitmore stood behind the small writing desk he used for figuring sums and signing what little paperwork came through Oakhaven. He had the look of a man who had already made up his mind and was simply waiting for the world to catch up with him, relieved and ashamed in equal measure, though the relief was winning. Across from him stood Caleb Morgan. Clara had seen Caleb Morgan exactly twice before, once when he came to buy lumber from Dennison's yard, and once when he passed through the mercantile, while she was behind the counter tallying ribbon spools for Mrs. Holt. He was tall in the way mountain men got tall, not elegant, but functional built, for weight and weather. He had dark hair gone gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't met a razor in probably a week, and eyes the particular color of river water before a storm. Grayish, watchful. Still, he didn't look like a man who had come to take a wife. He looked like a man who had come to collect on a debt and found the situation considerably more complicated than expected. "Clara," her father said. "Come in, girl. I need you to hear this." She stepped fully into the room. She did not look at Caleb Morgan. She looked at her father. "I already heard most of it," she said. Horace Whitmore had the grace to flinch. "Now you know the situation we're in. I owe Morgan here what I can't repay in coin or land. He's got 5 children up on that mountain and no woman to run his household since Eleanor passed 2 winters back." "Eleanor," Clara repeated. "His wife," Horace said. "God rest her." She finally looked at Caleb Morgan then. He was looking at her. Not with hunger, not with contempt, not with the particular expression men sometimes got when they were measuring a woman for usefulness. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he has not yet solved and is not sure he wants to. "You're agreeable to this?" she asked him directly. His jaw moved slightly. "I wouldn't say agreeable." "Then what would you say?" "Practical." He held her gaze. "I need someone who can manage a house and keep 5 children from burning the mountain down. Your father tells me you can cook, keep accounts, and aren't prone to hysterics." "My father," Clara said carefully, "has been wrong about most things for the last 3 years. Horace made a sound somewhere between a cough and a protest. Caleb Morgan did not move. "Can you, or can't you?" "Cook and keep accounts," Clara said. "Yes." "Prone to hysterics." She looked at him evenly. "You're standing in my house telling me my father has signed me over to you like a deed to an outhouse. Does this look like hysteria to you?" Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, more like recalibration. "No," he said. "It doesn't." "Then I'd call that your answer." Her father made a motion toward her, the beginning of a sentence about gratitude and practicality, and how this was really the best outcome given the circumstances. Clara stopped him with a look. Not anger, something colder than anger. The look of a woman who has decided that certain conversations are simply over. "When do we leave?" she asked Caleb Morgan. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "First light. I'll need the rest of today to pack. Take what you need." He paused. "Within reason." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Mr. Morgan, I was raised by a man who lost our family farm, our savings, and apparently our last remaining dignity, all within 3 years. I have very reasonable expectations about what I'm allowed to keep." He didn't respond to that. He picked up his hat from the side table. He'd set it there when he came in. She noticed, which meant he had manners, even if he had no warmth, and he settled it back on his head. "I'll be here at sunup," he said to the room in general, and walked out. Oakhaven was not a large town. It was the kind of place where news moved faster than weather, and everyone knew the shape of your life better than you did. By that afternoon, Clara was aware that the story had spread, not the details, those would take another day, but the general fact of it. She could tell by the way women looked at her when she walked to the dry goods to pick up what she needed. Some with pity, some with relief that it wasn't them. One woman, Mrs. Adelaide Pratt, who had been her mother's acquaintance and was nobody's friend, looked at her with a satisfaction so naked it was almost impressive. "Heard about your arrangement," Mrs. Pratt said at the counter. Clara placed her list in front of Mr. Tennyson and didn't turn around. "Then you've heard more than needs to be said about it. Morgan's a hard man, everyone knows it, lost his wife to the cold 2 winters back. Those children of his are half wild. The oldest boy, Thomas, they say he's mean as a cornered badger." "Mrs. Pratt," Clara said pleasantly, "I'd be grateful if you'd let me shop in peace. I'm only saying what's true." "I'm sure you are." She took the wrapped parcel Mr. Tennyson slid across the counter and picked up her basket. "Half the things people say are true. That doesn't mean they need saying." She walked out into the summer heat with her head level and her jaw set, and she did not let anything crack until she was around the corner of the cooperage and completely alone. Then she stood against the wall and pressed her hand flat against the warm wood planks and breathed. She was 19 years old. She had never been more than 40 miles from Oakhaven in her life. Tomorrow she was going into the Bitterroot Mountains with a man she did not know to raise 5 children she had never met, and she had not been asked. She had not been consulted. She had simply been signed over like a parceled lot, and she was not going to fall apart about it. Here in the alley behind the cooperage. She refused to, but she needed 1 minute. Just 1 minute to feel the full weight of it before she put it somewhere manageable and moved forward. The minute passed. She straightened. She picked up her basket. She walked back to her father's house and spent the rest of the afternoon packing with the systematic efficiency of a woman who has decided that if she cannot control what happens to her, she will at least control how she responds to it. Her father came to her doorway that evening. She was folding her mother's good quilt, the one with the double wedding ring, patterned pale blue and cream, and placing it at the top of her trunk. "Clara," he said. "Not now, Papa. I need you to understand. I understand, Papa." She pressed her palms flat on the quilt. "You were in an impossible position, and you made the best decision you could see. I understand." She turned to face him. "I don't forgive you for it yet, but I understand it." He looked older than she had ever seen him, hollowed out, like the shape of a man with the substance scraped away. She felt something complicated move through her, the old love still there, painful and persistent, underneath everything else. "He's not a bad man," her father said. "Morgan, I want you to know that. He's hard, yes, but he's not cruel. He won't—" He stopped. "He won't what?" she asked quietly. "He won't hurt you," Horace Whitmore said, and the very fact that he felt the need to say it told her everything about how low they had come. She turned back to her packing. "Get some sleep, Papa." She heard him stand there a moment longer, and then she heard him go. He came at sunup as promised. The wagon was a working wagon, not a farmer's cart. Something heavier built for mountain roads that weren't really roads at all. 2 sturdy horses. Supplies piled in the back. He was already on the seat when she came out, her trunk over one shoulder. She didn't wait for help, and when she hefted it up onto the wagon bed, he made no move to assist and no comment. She appreciated that. She didn't want his help. She wanted his respect, and those were not the same thing. Her father stood on the porch. He raised his hand. She looked at him for a long moment, Long enough for the complicated thing to move through her again, the grief and the anger, and underneath it all the terrible love that wouldn't stop no matter what he did. She raised her hand back. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat and looked straight ahead. Caleb Morgan said nothing. He clicked to the horses and the wagon moved, and that was that. 19 years in one place, and the leaving of it took less than 10 seconds. They had been on the road for perhaps 2 hours before either of them spoke. It was Clara who broke the silence, which she suspected surprised him. "Tell me about the children," she said. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the road, and she used that term loosely. It was more of a suggestion of a path that the mountain had reluctantly agreed to tolerate. "What do you want to know? Their names, their ages, what they're like." A pause. "Thomas is 14. He's the oldest. He runs things when I'm not there." "What does he think about this arrangement?" Another pause longer. "He doesn't know yet." Clara turned to look at him. "I beg your pardon." "I told them I was bringing someone to help with the house." He kept his eyes on the road. "I didn't specify the arrangement." "So they don't know I'm what?" "A permanent fixture." "I thought it better to let them see you first." She absorbed this. "And if they object, they'll get over it." "Mr. Morgan?" She waited until he looked at her. "That is either the most optimistic or the most naive thing I have heard from a grown man in recent memory." His jaw tightened slightly. "I didn't say it would be easy." "No," she agreed. "You said practical. There's a difference." She faced forward again. "Who are the others?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he started talking. It seemed to cost him something like a man unaccustomed to explaining himself who was making a deliberate effort. Ruth was 11, Daniel was 9, Abby was 6. And the youngest he paused on this one was Lily. She was 4 years old, and she hadn't spoken a word since her mother died 2 winters ago. Clara sat with that for a while. "She doesn't speak at all?" she finally asked. "Not a word. Does she understand what's said to her?" "Seems to." He shifted the reins slightly. "She follows directions. She just won't—" He stopped. "Talk," Clara finished. "Talk," he confirmed. Clara looked out at the passing landscape, the way the valley was already beginning to give way to steeper ground, the scrub and sage being slowly replaced by pine. The summer light was sharp and clear, the kind of blue sky day that didn't care at all about human misery. "What happened to Eleanor?" she asked. She asked it simply without apology, because she needed to know. Caleb Morgan's hands tightened once on the reins and then relaxed. "Fever," he said. "Came on fast. By the time I got a doctor up the mountain—" He stopped again. "By the time I got a doctor, it didn't matter anymore." "I'm sorry," Clara said. He gave a single stiff nod. "It was 2 years ago. That doesn't make it further away." He glanced at her then, just briefly, like she had said something he hadn't expected. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not empty. Something was settling into it. Not warmth, not yet. Maybe not ever, but something. Acknowledgement. 2 people in an impossible situation admitting to each other without words that they were both trying to navigate it with whatever dignity they had left. The cabin appeared around a bend in the trail in the early afternoon, and it was exactly what she expected, which did not make it easier. She had imagined something rough, and she had been right. What she hadn't imagined was the feeling, the atmosphere of the place. The way it sat at the edge of a clearing backed by dark timber, the way the summer heat seemed to hit the log walls and bounce off rather than soak in. It was not a welcoming place. It was a surviving place. There was a difference, but it was the children that took her breath. Not because they were frightening, because they were not what she'd expected, and she'd prepared herself for something specific and gotten something else instead. They were all outside. Thomas stood on the porch steps with his arms crossed over his chest, and yes, she could see immediately why people called him a cornered badger. He had his father's jaw, and none of his father's restraint, and the look on his face when the wagon pulled up was the look of a young man who had appointed himself the guardian of something sacred and was fully prepared to defend it with his body if necessary. He was 14 years old, and he had the eyes of someone much older and much more tired. Ruth was at his shoulder, darker in coloring, watching carefully. Daniel was around the corner of the cabin with a stick in his hand, and he stopped when the wagon came into view. Abby was in the yard, and she alone did not look guarded. She looked curious. She looked like a child who had not yet learned that curiosity could be used against you. And Lily. Lily was on the porch beside her brother. Small, dark-haired like Ruth. Looking at Clara with the clearest, most uncommitted gaze Clara had ever seen on a human face. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop. Thomas didn't move from the steps. The silence had a shape to it, charged waiting. Caleb climbed down and said, "This is Miss Whitmore. She's going to be staying on." Thomas looked at Clara the way people look at a wound they're deciding whether to clean or leave alone. "Staying on," he repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means what it means," Caleb said. "Does it mean what I think it means?" Thomas asked. His voice had not broken yet, but it was starting to, and the conflict between child and man in it made him sound angrier than he probably intended. "Thomas." Caleb's voice carried a warning. "Because if you think I'm going to call her—" "I don't ask to be called anything," Clara said. Everyone looked at her. She had climbed down from the wagon seat while they were talking, and now she was standing in the yard with her hands quiet at her sides, looking at Thomas with the same level attention she'd given Caleb that morning in her father's front room. "I'm not here to replace your mother," she said. "I can't do that, and I wouldn't try. I'm here because your father needed help running this house, and I needed somewhere to be. That's the beginning and the end of it." Thomas stared at her. "Is that supposed to make me like you?" "No," she said honestly. "I don't expect you to like me. I just appreciate it if we could be in the same house without it being a war. And if I don't agree to that—" She looked at him steadily. "Then I suppose it'll be a war. But I'll tell you straight, Thomas, I've been in a war for the last 3 years, and I haven't lost one yet. So if that's the choice you're making, make it with your eyes open." The silence stretched. Then Abby said with complete seriousness from her spot in the yard, "I like her hair." Something broke in the tension, not resolved, just interrupted. Ruth made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Daniel emerged fully from around the corner of the cabin. Thomas's jaw worked, and Lily on the porch watched Clara with those clear, uncommitted eyes and said nothing. The inside of the cabin was what it was. Clara did a thorough walk-through that afternoon, while Caleb unloaded the wagon and the children maintained their various orbits around her. Abby curious, Daniel uncertain, Ruth watchful, Thomas pointedly absent, Lily a silent shadow at the edge of her vision. She catalogued what was there and what was missing with the same systematic attention she'd given to her packing the night before. The kitchen was functional, but neglected. The stores were adequate for summer, but would need planning for fall. The sleeping arrangements were tight, 1 main room, 2 small side rooms, and a loft. She would have to figure out where she fit. She found a small curtained space off the kitchen that had apparently served as storage and decided that would do. What she noticed most was the absence of order. Not of cleanliness. Exactly, the children were not living in squalor, but of the 1,000 small systems that keep a household from slowly unraveling. Things in wrong places. Procedures that had collapsed when the person who maintained them died. 2 years of entropy. She started that same afternoon. She did not ask permission. She did not announce what she was doing. She simply began reorganizing the kitchen stores, assessing what needed mending, building a picture in her head of the work that lay ahead. She kept her movements quiet and deliberate, not wanting to alarm anyone. Caleb found her at dusk standing at the kitchen table with his account book open, which she had located in the top drawer and opened without ceremony. He stopped in the doorway. "That's my account book. I know. Your stores are lower than you probably think. You've got enough flour to last maybe 6 weeks if we're careful, less if we're not. Your salt pork is adequate. Your dried beans need sorting. Half of them have gone to weevil." She looked up. You're also down 4 laying hens if this record is current. Do you know what happened to them? He stood very still. Fox got into the coop in April. Did you repair the coop? A beat. Partially. I'll look at it tomorrow. She turned a page. Your sugar is critically low. I'll need to get a list together for supplies. Do you go into town on a schedule or? Once a month, he said. He still hadn't moved from the doorway. Usually first Monday. That's 2 weeks out. Can we make it stretch? He looked at her for a long moment. You always like this. She met his gaze. Like what? Efficient, he said. Like he hadn't quite expected the word to be what he wanted and used it anyway. I find that systems make difficult situations more manageable, she said. And Mr. Morgan, I think we can both agree this situation requires management. He came into the kitchen then. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she pushed the account book across the table to him, and they went through it together. Her asking questions, him answering both of them, building an inventory of what the mountain required to survive the coming months. It was the most words she'd heard him put together since they'd left town. It was not a conversation exactly. It was a negotiation. A working through of a shared problem by two people who were not yet sure they trusted each other, but who were increasingly certain they needed to. When they were done, he closed the account book. He sat there a moment. You can have the side room on the left, he said. Ruth and Abby are in the right. Thomas and Daniel are in the loft. Lily sleeps with the girls sometimes, and sometimes with the boys depending on the night. Depending on the night, Clara repeated. She moves around. He paused. She has nightmares. She goes where she feels better. Clara absorbed this. All right. He stood. He picked up the account book and put it back in the drawer. At the door, he stopped. The list for supplies, he said. Leave it on the table before you sleep. I'll look it over tonight. It was not a thank you, but it was something. She recognized it as such, and that was enough. Supper that first night was a revelation. Not because it went well, because she learned more about the 5 Morgan children from one shared meal than she could have from a week of separate conversations. She cooked simply not trying to impress, just trying to feed. Cornmeal mush with salt pork, and the last of some preserved summer berries she'd found in the back of the larder. Nothing remarkable. The children came to the table with varying degrees of reluctance and settled into what were clearly established positions. Thomas at the far end, Ruth beside him, Daniel across from Ruth, Abby next to Daniel, and the space where Lily eventually appeared and sat without being asked, without being told, as if she navigated by some internal compass that had nothing to do with instruction. Caleb sat at the head. Clara sat where she could see everyone. Thomas ate without speaking and without looking at her, which she had expected. Daniel ate with the focused determination of a 9-year-old boy who has learned that food does not wait. Ruth ate neatly and watched everything, and Clara got the distinct impression that Ruth was the one who actually kept things running in the unstructured space between Caleb's absences and the general chaos of a household without a mother. Abby said, apropos of nothing, Miss Whitmore, do you know how to braid hair? I do, Clara said. Ruth does it too tight, Abby said. Abby? Ruth said flatly. It's just true, Abby said. It is a little tight, Daniel offered helpfully. Ruth's expression suggested she was reconsidering her positions on several of her siblings. Clara found herself almost smiling. I'll remember that, she told Abby. Lily had eaten about half her mush and then stopped. She was looking at the center of the table with an expression that was not vacant. Nothing about her was vacant. Clara was beginning to understand, but distant, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Clara watched her for a moment, and then very quietly said, Do you want more berries, Lily? Lily looked at her, direct, assessing. She nodded once. Clara spooned more berries onto her bowl. There you go. Lily looked back down at her bowl. She ate the berries. It was a small thing. It was also the first transaction they'd had, and Clara filed it carefully. After supper, Thomas disappeared outside. The younger children began the ritual of getting ready for bed. Ruth directing Daniel, resisting mildly. Abby commentating on everyone else's process, Lily moving through it all like water. Caleb was at the door, pulling on his coat. The evening dropped cold fast up here, even in midsummer, and Clara said, "Where are you going?" He stopped and looked at her with the expression of a man who hadn't had to explain his movements to anyone in 2 years. "Checking the animals." "Before you go." She handed him the supply list she'd written out. "I added notes on the priorities. The flour and salt are most urgent. Everything else is sequential." He looked at the list. Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it exactly. Recognition, maybe. Or the particular discomfort of a man receiving help he didn't ask for and finding it more useful than he wanted it to be. "I'll look it over," he said. Then he went out into the dark. Clara washed the supper dishes alone. She was tired in a way that had no bottom to it, not just physical, but the tiredness of a person who has been managing emergency after emergency for so long that the emergency itself has become the normal state. She was not going to cry about it. She had decided that in the alley behind the cooperage in Oakhaven, and she held to it now. When she was done, she dried her hands and went to look out the small kitchen window into the dark summer night. Somewhere out there was the mountain. Somewhere in this cabin were 5 children who hadn't asked for her any more than she'd asked for this. And somewhere nearby was a man who had paid for her the way you pay for a draft horse, and who had, despite everything, despite the impossibility of the whole arrangement, looked at the problem of her with something almost like respect. She was going to need more than that, but it was a start. She turned away from the window. She went to bed, and tomorrow the real work would begin. The first week Clara spent on that mountain taught her 3 things. The first was that Thomas Morgan did not hate her. Hate requires engagement, and Thomas had decided on something colder and more deliberate than hate. He had decided to wait her out. He operated on the assumption Clara could see it in every practiced movement, every carefully arranged absence that she was temporary. That if he simply refused to acknowledge her permanence, she would eventually prove him right and disappear. He cleared his plate before she sat down. He answered her questions with the minimum syllables required. He made sure to do it all within arm's reach of the rules of basic courtesy, so his father couldn't call it defiance. But it was defiance, of the most surgical kind. The second thing she learned was that Ruth was the real power structure of this household, and had been for 2 years. Ruth Morgan, at 11 years old, ran the Morgan children, the way a field general runs a campaign through information positioning and the strategic deployment of silence. She knew where everything was. She knew everyone's patterns. She knew which of her siblings needed managing and in what direction. She had stepped into the gap her mother left with the quiet ferocity of a child who understands that someone has to, and has decided without drama that it will be her. Clara recognized the posture immediately because she had worn it herself since she was 16 and her mother got sick. She did not make the mistake of treating Ruth like a child. And Ruth slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to respect that. The third thing Clara learned in that first week was that the mountain itself was working against her. Not in any dramatic way, just in the steady, accumulated way of a place that has its own logic and does not care for yours. The well rope needed replacing. The smokehouse latch was broken. There were wasp nests in 2 places that made whole sections of the yard dangerous for the younger children. The garden there was a kitchen garden that Eleanor Morgan had planted once, and it had been maintained with good intentions and insufficient knowledge for 2 summers, and it showed. Clara fixed the well rope herself on the second morning because Caleb was up the ridge checking fence line, and she was not going to wait. Thomas watched her do it from the barn door without offering to help. She called across the yard without turning around. "You going to stand there, or you going to be useful?" A long pause. Then, "Rope's done wrong. The knot you're tying won't hold the weight of a full bucket." She stopped. She looked at the knot. She looked at him. "Show me." Another pause longer, charged with something. Then he crossed the yard and showed her the knot his father had taught him, and she watched his hands carefully and redid hers, and he said, "Better," and went back to the barn. It was not a peace offering, but it was information freely given, and she filed it the same way she filed everything carefully, without expectation. That evening she mentioned it to Caleb not as a report, but casually, and he looked up from the harness he was mending with an expression she couldn't read. "He showed you the rope knot," he said. "He did." Caleb looked back down at the harness, but the set of his shoulders changed, slightly. Just enough that a person paying attention would notice. Clara was always paying attention. The wasps came to a head on the fourth day. Daniel had found one of the nests, the one built up under the eave of the storage lean-to, by the simple method of throwing a stick at it. He came into the kitchen at a flat run, with 3 stings already rising on his neck, and one on the back of his hand, and Clara had him at the table with a paste of baking soda and water on each sting before he'd fully stopped moving. "Hold still," she said. "It burns," he said, but he held still. He was a reasonable child, Daniel, easily redirected. "I didn't know there was a nest there." "I knew," she said. "I was going to deal with it this week. That's my fault." She pressed the paste firmly onto the sting on his neck. "Where's your sister?" "Which one?" "Any of them." "Ruth's in the garden, Abby's with the chickens, Lily's—" He paused. "I don't know where Lily is." This was said with the casual acceptance of a child who has learned that Lily is often somewhere unspecified, and this is simply a fact of life. Clara noted it finished with his stings told him to sit for 10 minutes and not scratch them, and went to deal with the wasp nest herself. She did it with a jar of kerosene and the methodical calm of a woman who has decided that the world contains a finite number of problems, and most of them can be solved if you approach them without flinching. She was finishing up the nest down, and the area cleared when she heard a sound behind her, and turned to find Lily standing 6 feet away, watching. Clara didn't startle. She said conversationally, "I got rid of the wasps. They won't bother anyone now." Lily looked at the spot where the nest had been. She looked at Clara. She tilted her head slightly to the side. "Daniel's in the kitchen," Clara said. "He's going to be fine. Just some stings." Lily's gaze didn't waver. "You don't need to worry about him," Clara said. Lily turned and walked back toward the house. Clara stood there for a moment in the summer heat and thought about what it meant to be 4 years old and have no words. To move through a world that runs entirely on language with none of it available to you. To watch and watch and watch, because watching was the only currency you had. She thought she understood Lily better than anyone probably gave her credit for. She went back to the kitchen where Daniel was sitting exactly where she'd left him, blessedly not scratching. That evening, Lily chose to sit next to Clara at supper. Nobody commented on it. But Clara noticed Ruth noticing, and Thomas noticing Ruth noticing, and the whole silent transaction passing around the table like weather. The second week was when the real conflict started. It began with the bread. Clara had established a baking routine bread twice a week on Tuesday and Friday mornings, because routine was the skeleton of a functioning household, and she was building this one from the ground up. The children had adapted to it with varying degrees of acceptance. Abby liked to sit on the kitchen stool and watch. Daniel occasionally appeared to steal dough, which Clara allowed in measured amounts because it cost her nothing and purchased considerable goodwill. Ruth had begun tentatively to ask questions about technique. Lily sat in the corner by the stove and did whatever Lily did in her inner world, which was clearly extensive. Thomas did not come into the kitchen in the mornings, until the Tuesday of the second week, when he came in before she'd started and went directly to the shelf where she kept the starter culture she'd been building. She'd brought it with her, carefully wrapped, the last thing she'd packed, and he picked it up. "What is this?" he said. "Put it down, please," Clara said, turning from the table where she was measuring flour. "It smells wrong." "It's a starter culture for sourdough. Put it down, Thomas." "We don't make sourdough." "You do now." She held out her hand. "Please." He looked at her hand. He looked at the jar. There was a moment, it lasted about 3 seconds, when she could see him deciding, and what he was deciding was whether the jar was worth a confrontation. He put it on the table next to her. Not in her hand. On the table. Close enough to be compliance, far enough to be point made. My mother made biscuits, he said. I know, Clara said. I'll make biscuits too. I can make both. I didn't ask you to. She looked at him directly. No, you didn't. She went back to measuring her flour. You know, Thomas, you've got two choices about how you want this to go. You can spend the next however many years treating everything I do as an offense, or you can let some of it just be bread. She leveled the flour carefully. Your choice, but I'm making both. He left the kitchen, but she noticed that Friday that he ate 2 full slices of the sourdough without comment. She made sure not to notice out loud. Caleb was gone more than he was present in those first 2 weeks. He was up the mountain checking fence lines, clearing deadfall from the summer storms, maintaining the kind of ongoing campaign against entropy that a high mountain property required in the warm months. He left before full light and came back at dusk or after, and Clara was in the plainest terms running the household alone. She didn't complain about it. She wasn't sure what complaining would even look like here. To whom would she complain, and about what specifically, and what would she expect him to do? He was doing what the mountain required. She was doing what the house required. That was the arrangement, even if it hadn't been articulated as such. What she did do on the evening of the second Saturday was wait up. He came in close to full dark, and she was at the table with the account book and the week's figures, and she had a plate covered with a cloth she'd saved him supper, and she'd made coffee, which she'd learned he drank at any hour without apparent effect on his sleep. He stopped when he saw the lamp still lit. You didn't need to wait up, he said. I have the figures from the week, she said. It's easier to go over them now than try to reconstruct everything Monday morning. He came to the table. He picked up the coffee. He sat down. And for the next 40 minutes they went through the week, what had been used, what needed to be added to the supply list, what she'd noticed about the garden and the animals and the small structural issues of the property. She was thorough and factual. He asked questions when he needed to. He added information she didn't have. When they were done, he sat back and looked at the table rather than at her. The children, he said. How are they? It was not quite a question. Abby is fine. Daniel is fine. Ruth is carrying too much. She's been the woman of this house for 2 years, and she doesn't know how to stop, and I'm trying to ease that without making her feel replaced. She paused. Lily sits with me now. He looked up at that. In the mornings, Clara said. She comes and sits by the stove while I work. She hasn't said anything, but she comes. Caleb was quiet for a moment. That's more than she does with most people. I know. Clara closed the account book. Thomas is Thomas. He's going to be Thomas for a while. Has he given you trouble? She considered her answer. He's given me the particular trouble of a young man who is protecting something sacred and isn't ready to believe it doesn't need protecting anymore. That's not the same as trouble. Caleb looked at her again with that expression she'd catalogued, now the one where she'd said something he wasn't expecting. It was happening more often, and she wasn't sure whether that was because she was surprising him or because he was simply not used to being talked to by someone who said exactly what they meant. You're not what I expected, he said. She raised her eyebrows slightly. What did you expect? Honestly? He put down the coffee cup. Someone who'd last 3 days and asked to go back to town. And now... He looked at her steadily. Now I'm starting to think you might be more stubborn than the mountain. She held his gaze. Let's hope so. The mountain doesn't seem to be in a conceding mood. Something happened in his face then. Something small suppressed before it fully formed, but she caught the edge of it. It was almost a smile. Almost. It was the closest thing she'd seen from him, and she filed it with the rope knot and the account book and Lily by the stove the way you file evidence of a thing you're not sure you believe yet, but are starting to. Then he stood, said good night, and went to bed. She sat at the table for another minute in the lamplight. Outside, the summer dark was full of cricket sound, and somewhere a nightbird called once and fell silent. She thought about Oakhaven, about her father's porch, about Mrs. Pratt and her naked satisfaction, and all the women who had looked at her with pity or relief or calculation. None of them had thought she'd last 3 days either. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. The third week brought the first real crisis, and it came not from the children or the mountain, but from town. A man rode up on a Thursday afternoon, a man Clara didn't recognize. Mid-40s, well-dressed, in the way that means you spend money to look like you don't care about money. He had the manner of someone accustomed to delivering information as a courtesy, even when it isn't one. He tied his horse at the post and looked around the yard with the slow assessment of a man taking inventory. Clara was at the well. She watched him. "Looking for Morgan," he said to her. Not rudely, but without particular interest in who she was. "He's up the ridge," she said. "Should be back by evening." "I'll wait." He dismounted. "Name's Aldridge. Harlan Aldridge." He said it with the slight emphasis of a man who expects to be recognized. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of asking. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "Can I ask your business? Land matter," he said. "Nothing for you to trouble yourself about." She kept her face perfectly still. "Of course," she said, and went back to drawing water. She spent the rest of the afternoon doing what she always did when she was paying close attention, moving quietly through the spaces where information existed. She didn't hear everything. She didn't need to. By the time Caleb rode back in at dusk, she had enough. Aldridge owned a holding company. The holding company held paper on 3 mountain properties, including apparently a portion of the pasture land that formed the eastern boundary of the Morgan claim. He had a document, she'd seen him with it, the particular thickness and folding of legal paper, and he'd spent his waiting time walking the yard with the slow comfort of a man who believes the ground beneath his feet is already his. Caleb came in from the barn, and she met him at the kitchen door. "There's a man named Harlan Aldridge in your front room," she said quietly. "He's been here 3 hours. He has legal papers, and he walked your eastern pasture twice." Caleb went absolutely still. "He says it's a land matter," she said. The stillness shifted into something harder, more directed. "Where are the children?" "Ruth has them in the back. I asked her to keep them occupied." Something moved across his face, rapid functional. "You knew." "I could see what he was doing," she said simply. He looked at her for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. Then he straightened, squared his jaw, and went in to face Aldridge. Clara went to the kitchen. She made coffee. She kept the door cracked. She heard enough. Aldridge had paper that suggested a section of Morgan land had been used as collateral on a debt that Caleb's brother, a brother Clara had not heard mentioned, had signed before disappearing 6 years ago. The paperwork was questionable probably, but it existed, and in the territory existence was most of the argument. Caleb's voice stayed even throughout. Controlled. But she could hear the structure underneath it, and the structure was rage, the kind that has been managed so long it's become a kind of compressed fuel waiting. "I'll want to see the full documentation," he said, "and I'll want it reviewed by someone qualified before I sign or acknowledge anything." "Reasonable," Aldridge said pleasantly, in the way of a man who knows reasonable doesn't matter. "I'll have my man bring copies up next week. Just wanted to give you notice as a courtesy." He paused. "Fine property you've got here, Morgan. Shame to see it complicated." Clara heard the sound of the man standing of Caleb not moving. "Mr. Aldridge," Caleb said, and something in the way he said it made the air stop. "Yes. Next time you ride up here," Caleb said very quietly, "you send word first." A brief silence. Then Aldridge said, "Of course," and she heard his boots crossing the floor. He passed through the kitchen door rather than the front, which meant he passed through her space. And he looked at her with a reassessment. She recognized he was recalibrating who she was now that he understood she'd spent 3 hours watching him, and had gone immediately to Caleb with what she knew. He tipped his hat. It was polite. It was also acknowledgement. She nodded. Nothing more. He left. She poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the front room. Caleb was standing at the window. He didn't turn when she came in, but he took the cup when she held it out almost automatically. "Tell me about your brother," she said. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she almost withdrew the question. "His name is Garrett," Caleb said finally. "He left 6 years ago, before Eleanor died, before Lily was born." He drank the coffee. "He had a habit of signing things he didn't own." "Do you have clear title documentation?" "I have what I have." "Which means what exactly?" He turned to look at her then. The expression on his face was complicated. Not anger, not exactly, but the compressed version of it, and underneath that, something that was closer to exhaustion. A particular kind of exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time without being allowed to put it down. "It means," he said, "that Garrett may have done what Aldridge is saying, and if he did, I have a fight on my hands." Clara sat down in the chair across from his. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She said, "Do you have a lawyer?" "No." "You need one." "I know." "In town? Or—" "There's a man in Helena. Took cases for the territory." He paused. "Haven't had cause to contact him." "You have cause now." She looked at him steadily. "Write to him this week. Don't wait for Aldridge's copies. Get ahead of it." He looked back at her. "You're not—" He stopped. "I'm not what—" "You're not what most people would do in this situation," he said. "Most people would be worried about what happens to them if the land goes." She held his gaze. "I am worried about that," she said honestly. "But worrying about it isn't useful. Writing to the lawyer in Helena is useful. So that's what I'm suggesting." Caleb Morgan looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the reassessment of an adversary or the inventory of a man who has paid for something, but the focused attention of a person trying to understand something that doesn't fit the categories they already have. "Write the letter," she said. "I'll help you with the language if you want." He said, "All right," and that was that. She helped him write it that night after the children were in bed, the two of them at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, her suggesting phrasing, and him modifying it with the particular efficiency of a man who does not waste words even when writing them down. By 9 o'clock it was done. He folded it and addressed it, and set it by the door to go out with the next rider heading to town. When she finally went to bed that night, she lay awake in the small curtained room and listened to the night sounds of the cabin settling around her, the breathing of 5 children in their separate spaces, the creak of Caleb's boots in the main room before he finally went to his own bed. And she thought about Harlan Aldridge walking this property like he already owned it. She thought about what she'd built in 3 weeks, the bread routines and the supply system and the account book and the wasp nests and the rope knot and Lily sitting by the stove and Thomas eating the sourdough in silence. She thought, this is mine now too. Not by any paper, not by any signature, by the accumulated weight of work and presence and the particular claim that a person makes on a place by choosing day after day to be there. Nobody was going to take it. She wasn't sure yet how she would stop them, but she was starting to understand that she would. The following week moved with the speed that hard work always has, full and fast and measured. Not in hours, but in tasks, completed, problems managed, small victories claimed. Daniel grew 6 inches of courage and started following Clara around the property, asking questions about everything from how soap was made to why the well needed the specific kind of rope knot Thomas had shown her. She answered everything. She liked his questions. They were the questions of a child who wanted to understand how the world worked, and she had always found that particular hunger more trustworthy than any other kind. Ruth asked her on a Thursday if she would show her how to do the bread. Not asked exactly. Ruth's approach to requests was more oblique. She appeared in the kitchen on bread morning and said while looking at the window, "I've been meaning to learn the starter method." "Then stay and I'll show you," Clara said. Ruth stayed. She was precise and careful, and she had her father's quality of intense attention, and by the end of the morning she had the process. Clara told her she'd done well, and Ruth said, "It's not complicated," which Clara recognized as Ruth's version of thank you. Abby, meanwhile, had appointed herself Clara's shadow in a way that was more joyful than any of the other children's approaches. She chattered constantly, reported on the activities of the chickens with the seriousness of a government census, and had taken to braiding her own hair in the mornings, with only partial success, and then presenting herself to Clara for finishing adjustments. Clara did it without comment every morning neatly, and the ritual of it accumulated into something that felt around the edges like the beginning of tenderness. Thomas remained Thomas, but there were increments. He started leaving his plate on the counter rather than taking it directly to the wash basin, a small thing, but it meant he was letting Clara wash it, which meant he was accepting some form of her service, which was a hairline crack in the wall. He fixed the smokehouse latch without being asked. He didn't tell her he'd done it. She noticed and said nothing. He began to not leave the kitchen quite as quickly when she was there. And then came the afternoon, 3 weeks and 4 days in, when Clara was at the garden trying to salvage what she could of the beans. There were good ones in there, they just needed dedicated attention, and Thomas appeared at the fence and stood there with his hands in his pockets. She kept working. He stood there. Finally, my mother planted those beans. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at the garden, not at her. I know, she said. Ruth told me. A pause. She planted them every year since Thomas was 8. He would have been 8 when they started. He caught himself using his own name, and the faintest color rose in his face. When I was 8. She clearly knew what she was doing, Clara said. The soil is still good. I can bring them back. Thomas looked at the beans for a long moment. She used to put a little fish meal in when she turned the soil in spring, he said. Said it was what her grandmother taught her. Clara looked at him. He still wasn't meeting her eyes, but he was talking, which was its own form of extraordinary. Fish meal, she said. I'll do that next spring. He was quiet. Then in a voice that was working hard to be neutral, she'd want someone to keep them going. The beans. It was possibly the most complicated sentence Clara had heard in her life. It contained about 40 different things, grief and permission and accusation, and the tentative opening of a door that he wasn't ready to fully open, and wasn't ready to keep closed either. She said, I'll keep them going, Thomas. He nodded once, sharp, definitive. The nod of someone who has said all they're capable of saying on a subject, and is now closing it. He went back to the barn. Clara turned back to the beans. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from effort. She pressed them flat against the warm soil for a moment, and the shaking stopped. 3 weeks and 4 days. The mountain was starting to know her name. That evening, Caleb came in from the north fence, and he was carrying something. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of him coming across the yard faster than usual, and when he came through the door, she saw he had a length of damaged fence wire coiled over his shoulder and a cut on his left forearm that had been bleeding long enough to dry into a dark crust from his wrist halfway to his elbow. She was at the stove. She turned and looked at him and said, Sit down. It's fine, he said. Caleb. She said his name, his first name, the first time she'd used it, and she heard it land, heard him register it. Sit down. He sat down. She got the basin and the water and the cloth and the iodine she kept in the medicine shelf, and she cleaned the cut without ceremony. He was still while she worked, completely still, the stillness of a man who has learned that some things have to be gotten through, and the fastest way is to not fight them. He watched her hands. How did it happen? She asked, working along the edge of the cut. Wire snapped back, he said. Frayed cable. Didn't see it in time. You need to be more careful. I know. If something happens to you up on that ridge? She stopped, reframed it. The children need you functional. He was quiet for a moment. What were you going to say? He said. She pressed a clean cloth against the cut. I said what I meant. You stopped in the middle of it. She looked up at him. He was closer than she'd realized, the basin between them, but the space of it compressed by the necessary proximity of what she was doing. He was looking at her with the same focused attention she'd seen in the front room the night they wrote the letter, and it was heavier this time, somehow more present. I was going to say I need you functional, she said. And that's the truth. Something in his face shifted. Not the almost smile from before. Something quieter than that. Clara, he said. It was the first time he'd used her name without prefix. Just her name said plainly in the voice of a man who is not in the habit of saying things without meaning them. What she said, keeping her eyes on the cut. He didn't say anything else. But he didn't move either, and she finished with the bandaging in a silence that was the most loaded silence she'd experienced in a month of loaded silences. And when she was done, she picked up the basin and turned away, and let both of them breathe normally again. That night Ruth came to her curtained room doorway. Clara was reading. She'd found 3 books in the cabin, Eleanor's, and she was working through them in the evenings. She looked up. Ruth stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, not aggressively, but the way you cross your arms when you're holding something tight. "Thomas talked to you today," Ruth said. "He did." "About the beans." "About the beans," Clara confirmed. Ruth looked at the floor for a moment. "He doesn't talk about her. About Mama. Not to anyone." "I know," Clara said. "He must have decided you were worth it," Ruth said. Not warmly, not coldly either, just Ruth factual measuring filing information the same way Clara did. "I'll try to be," Clara said. Ruth looked at her for a long moment with those watchful eyes that missed nothing and forgave nothing quickly. Then she said, "He takes his coffee black, in the morning. He won't ask for it, but he drinks it if it's there." She walked back down the hallway. Clara sat with them for a while. The weight of it. The small, careful, enormous thing, Ruth had just handed her information about her brother's coffee, offered as both instruction and endorsement. She blew out her lamp. Outside, the summer night was full and warm, and the mountain pressed close in the dark, enormous and indifferent and present. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel, weather turning, not a dramatic change, just a pressure difference in the air. Something had moved in this house of 5 damaged and surviving children and 1 hard, careful man. And the thing that had moved was the possibility of something other than survival. Not yet love, not yet home, not yet anything she had a word for. But a door. The first one she hadn't had to pry open. The first one that had opened from the inside. The coffee was there every morning from that point forward. Clara made it before the children were up, set it on the back edge of the stove where it would stay warm, and said nothing about it. Caleb came in from the early chores, poured a cup. Drank it standing at the counter, the way a man drinks coffee he didn't ask for, and therefore doesn't have to acknowledge receiving, and that was that. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. Ruth noticed. She noticed the way Ruth noticed everything without comment, without expression, with only the faintest adjustment in the way she moved through the kitchen, in the mornings slightly less guarded, as if she had been waiting for evidence of something and had now received it. Thomas noticed too. He said nothing, but he stopped leaving the room before Caleb finished his coffee, and the 3 of them. Caleb standing, Clara moving through breakfast preparations, Thomas pretending to be occupied with his boots or his hat or whatever prop he'd selected for the morning, began to occupy the same space in the early light with something that was not quite ease, but was no longer war. It was the 4th week when Aldridge's man came back. Not Aldridge himself this time. A younger man, thin with the precise clothing of a legal clerk and a leather satchel that he carried with both hands as though it contained something fragile. He rode up on a Tuesday morning when Caleb was gone to the north pasture and Clara was alone in the yard with Abby and Daniel. She saw him coming, and she straightened up from the garden and she waited. He pulled up at the gate and said, "I'm looking for Caleb Morgan. I have documents for his review from Mr. Aldridge's office." "He's not here," Clara said. "I'll take them." The clerk hesitated. "These are legal documents, ma'am. I was instructed to deliver them to Mr. Morgan directly. And I'm telling you Mr. Morgan isn't here and I'm the one running this household." She crossed the yard to the gate and held out her hand. "I'll see that he gets them." The clerk looked at her hand. He looked at the satchel. He made the calculation that most men make when a woman looks at them with exactly that combination of calm and absolute certainty, the calculation that compliance is simpler than resistance. He handed over the satchel. "Tell Mr. Aldridge," Clara said pleasantly, "that Mr. Morgan will be in touch through his legal counsel." She smiled. "Good day." She took the satchel inside and spread the documents on the kitchen table, and read every page with the same systematic attention she gave to the account books. It took her 2 hours. Daniel wandered in twice, and she sent him back out both times without looking up. When Caleb came in at midday, she had the documents organized, annotated in the margins with questions in her careful handwriting, and a separate page of notes on the key claims, and what she understood to be their legal vulnerabilities. He stood at the table and looked at all of it. "Aldridge's man came this morning," she said. "I can see that." He picked up her notes, read them again. "You understood all of this. My father ran a dry goods store for 15 years before he ran it into the ground," she said. "He taught me to read a contract before he taught me to read a novel. I know what a fraudulent encumbrance looks like." She pointed to the third page of the documents. "This deed description here, the boundary markers don't match your eastern fence line. Whoever drew this up was working from an old survey or a bad one. Either way, it's contestable." Caleb sat down. He put the papers down. He looked at her. "Clara," he said and stopped. "Write to your lawyer today," she said. "Send him these and my notes. Don't wait." He didn't move for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "What would this place look like right now if you weren't here?" She held his gaze. "You'd be reading those documents alone tonight, probably not catching the survey discrepancy, and Aldridge would have a much easier time of it. That's not—" He stopped again, tried a different direction. "I mean to say, you've been here a month." 5 weeks, she said. 5 weeks. He pressed his palms flat on the table. "And you fixed the garden and the well rope and the smokehouse latch and the chicken coop and the supply system and the account books, and you're reading land fraud documents at my kitchen table." He paused. "I didn't buy all that when I signed your father's paper." She looked at him levelly. "No," she said. "You bought a housekeeper. What you got was me. Those aren't the same thing." She pulled the documents back into order. "Write the letter, Caleb." He wrote it that afternoon. She helped him again, and this time the language was sharper because she was sharper. 5 weeks on the mountain had burned away whatever remaining gentleness she'd brought up from Oakhaven, and replaced it with something harder and more precise. The letter went out that same day with a rider heading south. That night, Thomas came to the table for supper and sat down and said out of nothing, "Is the land going to be all right?" Caleb looked at him. "We're handling it." Thomas looked at Clara, not accusingly, not with the practiced blankness he'd perfected in the first weeks. He looked at her the way a 14-year-old boy looks at the person he has decided against his better judgment to half-trust with something important. "You read the papers." "I did," she said. And your father's lawyer is going to take it apart," she said. "Aldridge's claim has problems, real ones." Thomas absorbed this. He picked up his fork. He said, "Good," and ate his supper and said nothing else, but the quality of his silence was different. It was not hostile silence anymore. It was the silence of someone who has decided to stay at the table. The crisis with Lily came 10 days later, and Clara did not see it coming. She should have. Looking back, all the signs were there, the way Lily had grown slightly more unsettled in the days before, the way she moved through the cabin in tighter circles, the way she'd started appearing at Clara's curtained doorway at night and standing there without coming in. Clara had thought it was grief cycling the way grief does in small children, unpredictable and tidal. She'd left the door open further and said nothing, and let Lily stand there until she went back to bed. On a Wednesday evening, 3 days after Caleb had gone up to the high summer pasture to move cattle and said he'd be back by Thursday, Clara was in the kitchen after supper, and she heard Ruth's voice from the back room, sharp, alarmed in the controlled way Ruth did. Alarm which meant it was real. "Clara." She was already moving. Lily was in the corner of the girls' room on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, and her whole small body shaking with the kind of silent crying that is worse than any sound, because it means the child has already learned that making noise doesn't bring help. Her face was pressed into her knees. She was rocking. Ruth stood 3 feet away with her hands at her sides and her face doing the complicated math of a child who has managed this before and is managing it again, but would very much like to not be the only one managing it. How long? Clara said quietly. I heard her maybe 10 minutes ago, Ruth said. She gets like this sometimes. When Papa's gone. At night. Clara crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside Lily. Not touching. Not yet. Just present at the same level in the same space. Lily, she said. Her voice was the voice she used when she was being most careful, low, and even stripped of everything except the intention to be safe. Lily, I'm here. Lily's rocking continued. The shaking continued. Your Papa's coming back tomorrow, Clara said. He said Thursday, and he will. You know your Papa keeps his word. Nothing. Clara moved slightly closer. I'm going to put my hand on your back, she said. All right, just my hand. She waited 3 full seconds, and then placed her palm flat and warm against the center of Lily's back. The child flinched once hard and then went very still. The rocking stopped. The shaking continued, but finer now, less consuming. Clara kept her hand there. Behind her, she heard Abby come to the doorway, and Ruth's swift, quiet intervention. Go back to bed, Abby, and the sound of Abby going. She heard Daniel stop in the hallway and then turn back at some signal from Ruth she didn't see. Ruth knew how to manage a household. She'd been doing it for 2 years, but she'd been doing it alone. Clara sat on the floor with her hand on Lily's back for 20 minutes. She didn't talk much. Just occasionally Lily's name or a short sentence. Your Papa's coming back. I'm right here, you're all right. Not trying to talk the child out of anything, just marking the frequency. Saying there is a person here, you are not alone in the dark. Somewhere around the 20-minute mark, Lily moved. Slowly, like something uncurling from a very long-held position, she turned and pressed her face against Clara's side. Clara put her arm around her and held on. She didn't move. She barely breathed. She sat on the floor of that small room in the dark, with Lily curled against her, like something found and held, and she felt the weight of it, not just the child's physical weight, but the weight of what it meant. What it had cost Lily to choose this. What it cost children to keep choosing trust after trust has been broken by loss. After a while longer, the cabin gone fully quiet around them. Lily's breathing evened out. She had fallen asleep where she was against Clara's side, still on the floor. Ruth appeared in the doorway. Is she asleep? Ruth whispered. Yes. Ruth came in, and between the two of them they got Lily into her bed without waking her. Ruth with practiced efficiency, Clara following her lead. When it was done, they stood on opposite sides of the small bed and looked at the sleeping child, and Ruth said very quietly, She did that with Mama. When Mama was sick before she died. She'd come find her in the night. Clara looked at Ruth across the bed. She was looking for the same thing, she said. Ruth's face did something complicated. She was 11 years old, and she had been the woman of this house, and she was also a child who had lost her mother, and those two things lived in her simultaneously and imperfectly, and sometimes the seam between them showed. She came to your door, Ruth said. The last few nights, I saw her. I know, Clara said. Why didn't you? Ruth stopped. Why didn't I bring her in? Ruth nodded. Because she needed to choose it herself, Clara said. Not be invited. Not be told it was safe. She needed to get there on her own. She looked at Lily sleeping. She got there. Ruth stood very still for a moment. Then she said in a voice scraped down to its smallest possible size, I'm tired of being in charge of everything. Clara looked at her. I know, Clara said. You can stop now. Ruth's chin moved, once. The most controlled, most deliberate version of a sob that Clara had ever watched someone construct and contain. She held it together with the sheer, disciplined force of a child who has learned that falling apart is a luxury the person in charge cannot afford. You don't have to hold all of it anymore, Clara said. I'm here. That's what I'm here for. Ruth looked at her for a long time. Then she turned and walked out of the room, and Clara heard her door close, and in the silence, after she heard very faint, very brief, the sound of a child finally allowing herself to cry. She stood in the hallway, and let Ruth have it. Privately. With dignity. Then she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and sat at the table in the lamplight and allowed herself 5 minutes of her own. Not crying. Just sitting with her hands around the warm cup and acknowledging the weight of the last 5 weeks. The cumulative gravity of it all. The small, impossible things that had been required of her since the morning her father signed his name. 5 minutes. Then she straightened and went to check on Daniel and Abby, and then to her own bed. Caleb came back Thursday as promised. He came in to find the house running breakfast on the table, all 5 children fed and occupied, and Clara at the account books with her annotated notes on the Aldridge documents beside her. He stood in the doorway and looked at it all, and then he looked at her with an expression she didn't have a category for yet. "Everything all right," he said. "Lily had a hard night Wednesday," she said. "She's fine now. I'll tell you about it later when the children aren't around." He nodded. He sat down and ate the breakfast she'd kept warm, and later when the children were outside, she told him about Lily on the floor and the 20 minutes, and the way she'd finally turned and pressed herself against Clara's side. Caleb sat with that for a long time. His jaw was set in a way that meant he was holding something down by force. "She hasn't," he stopped. "She didn't do that with me, not since Eleanor." "She's been carrying it alone," Clara said. "She needed someone she could let see it." "She's 4 years old," he said, and the way he said it flat, almost disbelieving the weight of it too much for the sentence, told her everything about what it had cost him to watch his youngest daughter close off after her mother died and not know how to reach her. "She's not alone anymore," Clara said. He looked at her. The expression was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before. The managed distance was down, just briefly, just the width of a sentence. And what was underneath it was not hardness, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding everything together through the sheer, disciplined force of his will for 2 years, without once letting himself ask whether he was enough. He wasn't going to say any of what he was feeling. She knew that. He didn't have the language for it yet and possibly never would. So she didn't ask him to. She just said, "The Aldridge documents. Your boundary survey from the original claim, do you have it?" He blinked, came back to the present. "In the strongbox, under the bed." "Get it out," she said. "I want to compare it against what they sent." He went and got it, and they spent the next hour at the kitchen table with maps and documents, and her notes, and his knowledge of the actual land. And it was, as Clara had suspected, the Aldridge survey had been deliberately drawn from an older and less accurate record, and the discrepancy was significant enough that a competent lawyer would have grounds to contest the whole claim. "This is fraud," Caleb said. He said it quietly without heat, the way a man names a thing he has suspected and now confirmed. "It looks like it," Clara said. "Your lawyer will know better, but yes." "Garrett." He said his brother's name like a stone dropped into water. "I don't know if he did it knowingly or if they used him. Does it matter?" He thought about it. "For how I feel about it, yes. For what we do next, no." "Then focus on what we do next." He looked at her sideways. "You always this practical." "Only when things need to be done," she said. Something crossed his face, almost the smile closer than it had been before, and something else underneath it that she was starting to recognize, even if she didn't have a word for it yet. "I'm starting to think," he said slowly, "that things always need to be done around you." "Then it's a good thing I'm here," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then, "Yes," he said. "It is." It was the most direct thing he had said to her since the day they'd negotiated the account books, and she treated it with the same care. She'd treated Thomas's comment about the beans she filed it. She did not push on it. She let it be what it was. The rider came from town on the following Monday. Not Aldridge's man this time. A regular mail rider stopping on his circuit, handing over 2 letters, one for Caleb from his lawyer in Helena, which was faster than expected, and meant the man had understood the urgency, and one addressed to Clara, from Oakhaven, in her father's handwriting. She held it in her hands for a moment before she opened it. Caleb watched her. She was aware of him watching, but she didn't look up. She opened it. Horace Whitmore wrote the way he did everything in recent years, with the cramped apologetic penmanship of a man who has given up on elegance and is just trying to get from one end of the page to the other. He was fine, he said. The shop was managing. He had heard from Mrs. Tennyson that she'd been seen taking documents from Aldridge's man, and that people in town were saying she was running Morgan's place. And then in the last paragraph, something she hadn't expected. I am proud of you, Clara. I know I have no right to say that, but I am. I always knew you were more capable than I let you be. I'm sorry I had to lose everything before I let you prove it. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. Caleb said, "Good news or bad?" "My father," she said, "just checking in." He watched her face with the steady attention she'd come to expect from him. "You all right?" "I'm fine." She put her hand flat on the table. "What does your lawyer say?" He opened his letter, and they read it together, and it was as she had suspected. Good news buried in careful legal language. The Aldridge claim had significant procedural problems. The survey discrepancy was documented and provable, and with the original Morgan deed, the lawyer was confident he could have the encumbrance dismissed at circuit court. Caleb set the letter down. For the first time since she'd met him, the lines around his eyes loosened. Not a smile, something before a smile. Something that a smile grows from. "It's going to be all right," Clara said. "Looks like it," he said. "The land is yours." "Yeah." He looked at her. "Ours." The word landed between them like a stone thrown into still water, and the circles from it moved outward in all directions. He seemed to hear what he'd said approximately 1 second after he said it, and something tightened in his face. Not regret exactly, more like a man who has revealed something he wasn't prepared to reveal, and is deciding whether to cover it or let it stand. He let it stand. Clara said very evenly, "Yes, ours." And that was all that needed saying. The second big twist came not from Aldridge or from Garrett Morgan's ghost-written debts, but from Thomas. And it came on a Saturday afternoon at the worst possible time. Caleb had ridden to the south fence that morning and wasn't expected back until evening. Clara was in the smokehouse checking the pork. They were well into the summer stores now, and she was planning for fall when she heard the sound of a horse coming in fast. Too fast for regular visiting. She came out to the yard and recognized the horse before she recognized the rider. It was Jim Carver's bay from the Carver claim 2 miles down the mountain, and the person on it was Thomas. Thomas, who had been supposed to be clearing deadfall from the north wood line. Thomas, who was now pulling up hard at the yard gate with his face white under the summer brown and his eyes doing the specific kind of rapid calculation that means a teenager has done something wrong and is now trying to determine whether the best strategy is truth or prevarication. He dismounted before the horse fully stopped. "I need to talk to you." "I can see that," she said. "Talk." He pushed the gate open and came into the yard and stood there with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and she saw him decide. She watched the actual decision move across his face to tell the truth. It was not a small decision. It cost him something visible. "I got into it with 2 of Aldridge's men," he said. She went very still. "What do you mean got into it?" "They were on the east pasture, on our land beyond the fence line. I told them to get off." He paused. "They didn't." "Thomas." Her voice was even. "What did you do?" "I fired a warning shot," he said. "Over their heads, into the air." He met her eyes directly, which she gave him credit for. They left. The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone counting to a number large enough to be useful. "Were you alone?" she said finally. "Yes." "You were alone on the east pasture with 2 of Aldridge's men, and you fired a rifle." "Warning shot," he said again. "Over their heads." "Thomas." She took a breath. "How old are you?" 14. "You are 14 years old, and you fired a weapon at 2 grown men who work for a man who is currently in a legal dispute with your father." She looked at him. "Do you understand what that could mean? Legally. What they could claim?" The white in his face deepened. He hadn't thought that far. He'd thought as far as the fence line and the trespass and the rifle and the particular righteousness of a young man defending something he loves. He hadn't thought about Aldridge sitting down with a lawyer and a story about an armed miner and what that could do to the case Caleb's lawyer was building. "I didn't hit anyone," he said, but the certainty was draining out of it. "I know you didn't," she said, "but they don't have to prove you hit anyone. They just have to claim you threatened them, on disputed land." She moved toward him. "Did anyone else see this happen?" "No." "Are you sure no ranch hands, no one on the road?" He thought hard. "No, just us." She turned away and put her hand on the fence post and stood there for a moment organizing the problem. It was solvable. Maybe. If Aldridge's men were smart enough to use it, it was a complication. If they were greedy enough to try to use it without witnesses, it was a gamble they'd likely lose. "You were protecting the land," she said. She turned back to face him. "That was right. The method was wrong." He looked at her. "I wasn't going to let them stand there." "I know." She held his gaze. "You're your father's son. The land is yours, and you know it, and you were not going to let two hired men stand on it and smirk at you." She paused. "I understand that completely." Something shifted in his posture. Not relief, Thomas was too controlled for obvious relief, but a subtle easing, like a man who has been braced against a blow that turned out to be a hand. "You're going to tell Papa," he said. "Yes," she said. "Immediately. Tonight." He nodded. He'd expected that. "Thomas." She waited until he looked at her. "You need to tell him yourself, before I do. That's how this works. You tell him first tonight, and I back you up. That's the order." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because you're 14, and you did something that came from the right place with the wrong method, and your father needs to know you can own that. That's more important than the incident itself." Thomas was quiet. She could see him working it through the pride and the calculation, and underneath it, the buried complicated thing that was beginning to form between them, the thing neither of them had named yet, the thing that was not mother and son, but was not nothing either. "All right," he said. When Caleb came in that evening, Thomas was waiting for him in the yard. Clara watched from the kitchen window, not listening, not trying to hear, just watching the shape of it. The boy standing straight. Caleb still on his horse, then dismounting slowly. The conversation that lasted 10 minutes, Caleb's face going through several things she couldn't read at the distance. Thomas's chin staying level. Then Caleb put his hand on the back of Thomas's neck. One hand brief, firm, the way you steady something. Thomas didn't move away from it. When they came in together, Caleb looked at Clara across the kitchen. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. The look was enough. It contained the whole story, the recognition of what she'd done, and how she'd done it, and what it had cost Thomas to tell the truth, and what it had meant that she'd made him do it with dignity. Supper that night was louder than it had ever been. Abby told an elaborate and largely incoherent story about the chickens. Daniel argued with Thomas about something trivial. Ruth ate her food with the careful, quiet satisfaction of someone who has noticed that the temperature of the room is different than it has been and is deciding what to do about it. Lily ate all her food and then leaned sideways in her chair until she was pressed against Clara's arm. Clara let her stay there. Caleb across the table looked at his youngest daughter leaning against the woman who had come to this mountain 5 weeks ago as a debt payment and had since rebuilt his household, saved his land claim, and put a hand on his youngest child's back in the dark when she couldn't reach anyone else. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. He didn't say anything, but his eyes, when they met Clara's over the rim of the cup, said something that all his careful economy of words had not yet figured out how to carry. Clara held his gaze for 1 beat. 2. Then she turned to Abby and said, "Tell me more about the chickens." Abby told her more about the chickens. And the table stayed full and warm and loud with the sound of a family that had been broken and was not yet whole, but was gradually, imperfectly, stubbornly learning how to be something again. Outside, The summer was starting to turn at its edges. Not visibly. Just in the smell of the air in the early mornings, the faintest suggestion of something coming. The way a season shifts before you can see it shift. Clara felt it and said nothing. She had enough to carry. She would face fall when it came. The letter from Caleb's lawyer arrived on a Thursday, and by Friday morning, the Aldridge problem was effectively over. Not loudly. Not with any ceremony. The lawyer's second letter contained a single paragraph that mattered. The circuit court had reviewed the preliminary filing, found the survey discrepancy Clara had identified, and issued a stay on Aldridge's encumbrance claim, pending full review. Which the lawyer wrote, given the quality of the original Morgan deed documentation, was likely to result in full dismissal within 60 days. Caleb read it at the kitchen table while Clara made breakfast. He read it twice. Then he set it down flat on the table and sat there with both hands resting on either side of it. "It's done," Clara said without turning from the stove. "Near enough," he said. She put a plate in front of him. He looked up at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she'd seen from him in 7 weeks. Not happy exactly, because Caleb Morgan did not do happy the way other men did it, but relieved in the deep way of a man who has been bracing against something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can straighten up. "You caught it," he said. "The survey. If you hadn't caught it, you would have caught it eventually," she said. "Maybe." He held her gaze, but not in time. She sat down across from him. "Write and thank your lawyer. And write to the circuit court directly. There's language in that letter that suggests a personal acknowledgement would be appropriate. I'll help you with the wording if you want." He looked at her for a moment, in the way he had developed over 7 weeks, the look that was taking her apart and putting her back together with better understanding each time. "Clara." "What?" "Thank you," he said. Plain and direct, the way he said everything that mattered. No preamble, no softening. Just the words given to her like something he'd decided she'd earned. She held it evenly. "You're welcome." Thomas, appearing in the doorway with his boots already on and his hair still uncombed, looked between the two of them and said, "Is the land business settled?" "Near enough," Caleb said again. Thomas nodded once in the sharp, decisive way that was entirely his father's. Poured himself coffee. He'd started doing that recently, helping himself, which Clara took as a sign of comfort, and went back outside. Ruth, coming behind him, caught Clara's eye across the kitchen and said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved. From Ruth, that was practically a celebration. The days that followed had a quality Clara hadn't felt since she'd come to the mountain, something close to lightness. Not ease. The mountain didn't do ease, but a loosening of the specific tension that had been running underneath everything since the morning Aldridge's man rode up with his leather satchel. The household breathed differently. The children were louder in the way children get when the adults around them are less afraid. Even Caleb's morning silences had a different texture, less sealed, more simply quiet. Lily spoke. It happened on a Tuesday, 11 days after the lawyer's letter in the kitchen at mid-morning. Clara was at the table sorting dried beans. The weevil problem was ongoing and required regular attention, and Lily was in her customary spot by the stove doing whatever Lily did in her interior world, which remained largely private, even as she'd opened every other door. Clara had her back half-turned, focused on the beans when she heard it. "Clara, her name," said in a small, clear, deliberate voice. The voice of a child who has chosen a word with full awareness of what she is doing. Clara went completely still. She turned slowly, the way you turn when you are afraid that sudden movement will break something irreplaceable. Lily was looking at her. Directly. With those clear, assessing eyes that had watched everything from the beginning. She had a biscuit in her hand from breakfast, saved, apparently carried around the way small children carry comfort objects. "The biscuit's getting hard," Lily said, factually, as if she had simply been waiting for a sentence worth saying. Clara looked at her for one long moment. Then she said very carefully, very evenly, "Come here, and I'll get you a fresh one." Lily got up and crossed the kitchen and stood at the table, and Clara got her a fresh biscuit from the cloth and put it in her hand, and Lily bit into it and chewed and said, "Better." "Good," Clara said. Then Lily went back to her spot by the stove. Clara turned back to the beans. Her vision had gone somewhat blurry, and she blinked it clear with the focused efficiency of a woman who has decided that she will absolutely not cry over a biscuit in the middle of a Tuesday morning. She was not entirely successful. She told Caleb that evening privately in the kitchen after the children were in bed. She told it simply the way it happened, without decoration. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he sat there with his coffee and didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "Clara." "I know," she said. She hasn't spoken since Eleanor. "I know." He put the coffee cup down. He pressed both hands flat on the table. His jaw was working in the way it worked when he was holding something down by main force, and she watched him hold it, and then he said very quietly, "What did you do?" "Nothing," she said. "I was just there. Every day. I was just there." He looked at her across the table, and this time he didn't look away, and she didn't either, and the space between them had the charged, concentrated quality of something that has been building for 7 weeks under layers of practicality and survival and the daily business of keeping 5 children alive on a mountain, and it was too much to name, and neither of them named it. Finally, he said, "It's going to rain tomorrow. I'll be in the lower barn most of the day repairing tack." "All right," she said. "If you need anything, I'll find you," she said. He nodded. He stood. At the doorway, he stopped the way he sometimes did, and she waited. "You're good with her," he said. "With all of them." A pause. "I want you to know, I see that." Then he went to bed. Clara sat at the table for a long time after. The rain came as he'd predicted, heavy and steady, and the mountain turned gray and close. The children were inside all day, which introduced its own specific chaos. Daniel and Abby at pitched odds over a game that had unclear rules. Thomas manufacturing space for himself by sheer force of personality. Ruth managing the younger ones with her characteristic competence, while also visibly wanting everyone to be somewhere other than the main room. Clara ran the kitchen and kept the stove going and produced a continuous supply of small foods to keep the energy manageable, and answered approximately 47 questions from Daniel about how rain works, and let Abby braid a section of her hair with predictably chaotic results, and generally functioned as the load-bearing wall of the household, while the rain hammered the roof and the mountain disappeared into gray. It was late that afternoon when Lily came to find her. Lily didn't appear at her elbow the way she usually did. She came to the kitchen door and stood there and said, with the economy of a child who has just rediscovered words and is using them sparingly, "Abby fell." Clara was moving before the sentence finished. "Where?" "Porch steps." She came through the door and found Abby sitting on the bottom porch step in the rain, with her right arm held carefully against her chest and her face doing the specific contortion of a child deciding whether to cry. It was past deciding the tears were already coming silently, which was worse than noise. "Let me see," Clara said, kneeling in front of her. "It hurts," Abby said with the surprised indignation of a child unaccustomed to genuine pain. "I know." Clara ran her hands carefully along Abby's arm from wrist to shoulder. Abby hissed at one point midway up the forearm, and Clara felt carefully there and then again, more slowly. Not broken. She was nearly certain. But the pain was real, and the swelling was starting. She got Abby inside, wrapped the arm in cold wet cloth, gave her willow bark tea, which Abby made elaborate faces about, and sat with her until the sharp edge of the pain had softened. Then she got her settled on the main room settle with a blanket and the cat, which Abby held with intense proprietary comfort. Thomas appeared at the main room door taking stock. He looked at Abby, then at Clara. "How bad?" "Not broken," Clara said. "She'll be sore for a few days." He nodded, then quietly so Abby wouldn't hear. She was trying to catch the cat off the porch railing. "I told her not to." "Did you tell her before or after?" Clara said equally quietly. A pause. "Before." "Then you did your part," Clara said. "Go let your father know when he comes in." Thomas went to find Caleb, and Clara saw in his walk and the straightness of it, in the deliberate way he took on the task, something that had not been there 2 months ago. The posture of a boy, beginning to understand that responsibility is not a burden imposed from outside, but a shape you grow into. She turned back to Abby. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "A little," Abby said with great dignity. Then, "Clara, will you stay here with me?" "Yes," Clara said. She sat down beside her on the settle. "I'll stay." Abby leaned against her. The cat rearranged itself to accommodate both of them, and the rain kept coming. The fever started 3 days later. It started with Lily. Clara noticed at breakfast the slight glaze in Lily's eyes, the way she was moving more slowly than usual, the particular quality of her stillness that was different from her usual contemplative quiet. She put her hand to Lily's forehead and felt it and kept her face neutral. "Lily," she said, "how do you feel?" Lily considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "Hot," she said. "I know." Clara looked at Ruth. "Keep her in today. Keep her warm." Ruth looked at Lily and then at Clara with an expression that had all the alarm stripped out of it and replaced with function, which was Ruth's way of being scared. "How bad?" "Let's see how the day goes," Clara said. By mid-morning it was worse. By afternoon Lily's fever was high enough that Clara had her in bed with cool cloths and willow bark and was counting the hours. The mountain was completely soaked in the rain that had come and gone, had come back heavier, and the trail down was a running stream. Getting a doctor was not a possibility she was currently entertaining. She worked through what she knew, which was what her mother had taught her, and what she'd learned nursing her father through 2 bad winters, and what simple logic told her about fever in a small child. Keep her cool, keep her drinking, keep her calm. Caleb checked in every hour. She sent him back to the children each time they needed someone to hold the ordinary shape of the day, and she needed the sick room quiet. By evening, Daniel was warm. She felt his forehead after supper and closed her eyes for one moment and then opened them and said, "You're sleeping in the loft tonight. Keep away from the girls' room." "I feel fine," Daniel said. "Daniel," she said. He went to the loft. By the time the lamp was low and the cabin was otherwise asleep, it was Caleb who found Clara in the kitchen, refilling the basin with fresh, cool water for the 4th time, and her hands were shaking. Not from fear, she told herself, from the cold water and the hour, and the accumulated weight of a day that had not stopped requiring things from her. "Go to bed," he said quietly. "I'll sit with her." "I'm fine." "Clara, I know her patterns," she said. "I know how she sleeps and what sounds mean she's worse, and what sounds are just her dreaming. You don't know those things yet." She turned to face him. "I'll sleep in the chair in her room. I'll call you if it turns." He looked at her for a long time in the lamplight, really looked with that focused, total attention that she'd come to understand was how Caleb Morgan loved things, not with words, but with his whole sustained, serious regard. "All right," he said finally. "But you call me." "I will." She did not need to call him until 2 in the morning. She heard the change before she was fully awake. A shift in Lily's breathing, a new quality to it, labored in a way it hadn't been. She was at the bedside in the same motion as waking, her hand on Lily's chest, counting. She crossed the cabin and put her hand on Caleb's shoulder in the dark and said, "Come now." He was up without question. They worked together through the next 2 hours, Clara directing Caleb, following both of them focused entirely on the child in the bed. Fresh cloths. More willow bark coaxed in. Repositioning. Clara talking to Lily in the low, even voice she used when she needed Lily to know there was a person present, that the dark was not empty, that she was not alone. At some point she didn't know exactly when Caleb sat on the edge of the bed on the other side and put his large, work-rough hand on his daughter's small back exactly the way Clara had done on that first terrible night weeks ago, and he held it there without moving. The 2 of them on either side of her. The mountain pressing in at all sides. The fever broke around 4 in the morning. Clara felt it, the quality of Lily's skin changing under her hand, the sweat coming, the breathing easing. She said, "There," very quietly to no one in particular, and to both of them. Caleb let out a breath that he had apparently been holding since 2 o'clock. They sat there on either side of Lily until the child had settled into genuine sleep, not the restless burning semi-consciousness of high fever, but the deep limp recovering sleep of a body that has fought something and won. Then Clara stood up slowly, and her legs had the feeling of someone who has been stationary for too long, and she walked to the kitchen on autopilot and put the kettle on because something in her required a task, required something to do with her hands so that the rest of her could decompress. She heard Caleb's boots on the floor behind her. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table and put both elbows on it and his face in his hands just for a moment. Not dramatic, just a man allowing himself 10 seconds of being undone. She put coffee in front of him. He lifted his head and looked at her, and his face was open in a way she had never seen from him. Not vulnerable exactly. Caleb Morgan was not built for vulnerability, but honest. Stripped of all the management and the compression and the careful economy of feeling. Just a man sitting in his kitchen at 4 a.m, after the longest night of his recent life, looking at the woman who had stood on the other side of his daughter's bed and refused to let go. She stopped breathing, he said. For a moment, around 3, did you? I felt it, Clara said. I had my hand on her chest. What did you do? I told her no, Clara said. He looked at her. I told her no, she said again. I said, Lily, not tonight, not on my watch. She held his gaze, and she started again. Caleb sat with that for a long time. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not grasping, not pulling, just placed it there. His hand over her hand on the kitchen table at 4 a.m, warm and certain. She turned her hand over under his and held on. They sat like that until the coffee got cold, not talking because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already being said by the simple fact of 2 hands holding on in the dark. The morning came gray and washed, and the mountain was quiet. Daniel's fever peaked and broke within the same day. Almost anticlimactically, he was sick in the fierce, complete way of 9-year-old boys who do not do anything halfway, and then he was fine, demanding food by afternoon. Ruth developed a mild version enough to be miserable, but not frightening, and Clara managed her with the additional complication of Ruth being a terrible patient, not because she was difficult, but because she kept trying to get up and do things, and Clara had to physically sit her back down 3 times before she accepted that the household would survive without her management for 1 day. It will be there when you're better, Clara told her. What if I have Abby, and Daniel is going to eat everything in the... Ruth. Clara looked at her steadily. Lie down. Ruth lay down. She did it with the expression of someone who has been convinced by logic rather than desire, which was the only way Ruth did anything. Abby and Thomas did not get sick, which Clara attributed to whatever obscure biology determines who fever takes and who it leaves alone. Thomas spent the sick days in a sustained, quiet state of usefulness, fetching water, keeping the fire, taking on the outdoor chores without being asked. Not drawing attention to it, just doing it, the way his father did things. On the 4th day, when Lily was up and moving through the cabin in her ordinary way, trailing her hand along the walls, finding her spots. Clara was at the stove and felt a small weight settle against her side. She looked down. Lily had her arms around Clara's waist. Both of them, holding on with the serious, complete grip of a child who has decided that this person is hers to hold. Clara put her hand on the back of Lily's head, held her there. Neither of them said anything. The following evening, Caleb came in from the afternoon chores and found Clara at the table finally for the first time in 5 days, simply sitting. Not working, not planning, just sitting with her hands around a cup of tea in the particular stillness of a person who has been running at full capacity and has temporarily run out. He sat across from her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her over Lily's bed, with that stripped, honest attention. You need to rest, he said. I'm resting right now, she said. Properly, for a full day. Tomorrow, I'll manage the children. You sleep. She looked at him. You don't need to. Clara. His voice was quiet and final. Let me do something. She understood what he meant. He had spent 5 days watching her carry it, watching her be everything the household needed, watching her refuse to break, watching her hold his daughter back from wherever fever tries to take children. And he had been able to do very little except be present and follow directions and put his hand over hers at 4 a.m, and now he needed to give something back, and the giving was itself a kind of need. She said, "All right." He nodded. Then he said, and it came out with the difficulty of a man who has been composing it for several days, "I want to talk to you about something. When you're rested, there's something I need to say to you." She looked at him. "About the land?" "No." A pause. "Not about the land." The space between them was the charged, suspended space she recognized from other moments. The account book at night, the letter to the lawyer, his hand over hers. The space of something too large for the container of ordinary conversation, pressing against the edges of the words they had available. "All right," she said again. "When I'm rested." He nodded. She finished her tea. Finished. Outside, the mountain was doing what the mountain did, enormous and indifferent and present, pressing against the walls of the cabin from all sides. But inside, the fire was going. The children were distributed in their usual evening orbits. Daniel and Thomas in the loft, doing whatever boys do, that is mostly noise. Abby asleep early, because Abby could sleep anywhere at any time. Ruth reading by the lamp, Lily in her spot by the stove. Lily looked up and found Clara looking at her. She said, "Are you staying?" Clara went still. It was not a question about tonight. It was not a question about the week. It was the question a 4-year-old asks when she has lost the only person she was sure of and has been watching for 2 months to see whether this new person is the kind that stays. Clara crossed the kitchen and crouched down in front of her. She met those clear, serious, ancient eyes. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." Lily looked at her for a long moment with the full, total, unhurried consideration of a child who does not waste her words. Then she nodded once satisfied and turned back to whatever she'd been doing. Clara stood up. Caleb was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. His face was doing the thing it did when he was holding something large very carefully, the muscles around his jaw slightly set, his eyes carrying everything his mouth wasn't saying. She straightened. She looked at him. He looked back. And something settled between them, not spoken, not yet, maybe not for a while, maybe not ever in any clean or simple way, because neither of them were clean or simple people, and this was not a clean or simple situation, but real. The weight of it, real and solid, and the kind of thing that doesn't go away, because it isn't built from want alone, but from work and survival and the 1,000 daily choices to keep showing up. She said, "Good night, Caleb." He said, "Good night, Clara." She went to her room. She lay in the dark and listened to the cabin settle around her. The familiar sounds of it, now the creak she knew, and the draft she knew, and the particular quiet of 5 children in their various stages of sleep. Outside, the night was clear, after all the rain, and somewhere on the mountain, something called once, and was answered and was silent. She stared at the ceiling. "I'm staying," she had said to Lily. She had not said it to anyone else. She hadn't needed to. The mountain knew. The cabin knew. And somewhere on the other side of the wall, in the quiet of his own room, she was quite certain that Caleb Morgan knew it too. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow he was going to say something to her that he had been building for days. Something that was not about the land. She was not afraid of it. She was, for the first time in a long time, possibly for the first time in her life, not afraid of anything that was coming. She slept. She slept for 11 hours. When she woke, the cabin was already running. She could hear it, the specific sounds of a household in motion. Daniel's voice from somewhere outside Abby's higher pitch, answering the sound of water being drawn at the well boots on the porch. She lay still for a moment and just listened to it, the way you listen to something you've built and are checking for structural integrity. It held. She got up and dressed and came out to find the kitchen already warm, the stove going coffee made. Ruth was at the counter cutting bread with the careful precision she brought to everything, and she looked up when Clara appeared and said without preamble, "Papa made the coffee. It's too strong. I told him." But he said you'd say the same thing if you wanted to. Clara crossed to the stove and poured a cup. It was, in fact, extremely strong. She drank it anyway. "Where is he?" she said. "Barn," Ruth said. "He's been out there since first light. He told us not to wake you." Clara stood with the coffee and looked at Ruth, this girl who had been 40 years old at 11 and was now incrementally finding her way back to something younger. Her hair was looser this morning. She was humming something under her breath without seeming to know she was doing it. "Ruth," Clara said. Ruth looked up. "You did well last week, with all of it." Ruth's hands stopped on the bread knife. She looked at Clara with the expression of someone receiving something they'd stopped expecting. "I just did what needed doing." "I know," Clara said. "That's what I mean." Ruth looked at the bread for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas said the same thing, last night. He said you hold things together the way Mama used to." She paused. "He didn't say it to you. He said it to me. But I thought you should know he said it." Clara set the coffee cup down carefully on the counter. She needed a moment and she took it, turned toward the window and let the moment pass through her. Thomas Morgan, who had stood in his own kitchen with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his grief wrapped around him like armor, saying her name in the same sentence as his mother's. She turned back. "Thank you for telling me." Ruth nodded once satisfied and went back to the bread. Clara went out to find Caleb. He was in the barn, as Ruth said, working on a section of harness with the focused attention he brought to physical tasks complete, unhurried, each movement purposeful. He heard her come in and looked up, and something moved across his face that he didn't quite manage to contain before she saw it. Relief. She recognized it because she knew what it looked like on him now, the slight softening around the jaw, the way his shoulders settled. "You slept," he said. 11 hours, she said. "The coffee's strong." "I know how to make coffee." "You know how to make something that shares a name with coffee," she said. "That's not the same thing." The almost smile, closer than ever. She was beginning to understand it would probably always be almost that full, open smiling was not in Caleb Morgan's architecture. And that was fine, because she was learning to read everything that lived in the space around the almost. He set down the harness. He turned to face her fully. "I said I wanted to talk to you." "You did," she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment, and she could see him assembling it, arranging the words with the same care he gave to everything, because Caleb didn't speak until he knew what he meant. "When I rode down to Oakhaven and signed that paper with your father," he said, "I told myself I was solving a practical problem. A man with 5 children and a mountain to run needs someone who can manage a house. That's what I told myself." "I know," she said. "I was wrong about what I was solving for," he said. "Or not wrong, incomplete." He held her gaze. "You didn't come here and manage a house, Clara. You came here and held this family together when I didn't know how to do it myself. You held Lily. You gave Thomas a way back in. You took Ruth's weight off her. You sat at my kitchen table at 4 in the morning and told my 4-year-old daughter no when she was trying to stop breathing." She didn't say anything. She let him finish. "I am not a man who says things lightly," he said. "You know that." "I know that," she said. "So when I say I want you to stay, not as a household arrangement, not as a debt settlement, not because it's practical, you should know that I mean it as something else." He paused. "Something I don't have a lot of practice saying." The barn was quiet around them. Outside, she could hear Daniel and Abby in some ongoing negotiation about something trivial, the particular sound of children who are safe enough to argue about nothing. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I'm trying to," he said. "I reckon I'm not doing it elegantly." "You don't need to be elegant," she said. "Just say it plainly." He looked at her. "I want you to be my wife, not on paper, not as arrangement, as the real thing." A pause. "If you're willing." Clara held that. Not from uncertainty she'd known for some time where this was going, had known the way. You know weather is turning before you can see the change, but because it deserved to be held. Because this man who had spent 7 weeks rebuilding the capacity to say something like this to another person deserved to have it received with the full weight it carried. You understand, she said carefully, that I'm not doing this out of gratitude, or because I don't have another option. If I said yes, it would be because I chose it. I'd want nothing less, he said. And you understand that I'm not Eleanor, she said. I'm not trying to be Eleanor, and I never will be. Something moved through his face. Not pain exactly. Something more complex than pain, the recognition of a truth that has been settled and accepted. I know who you are, he said. I'm asking for you. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, Yes, Caleb. I'm willing. He let out a breath, slow, complete. The breath of a man who has been holding something suspended for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. He crossed the distance between them and took her hand, both of her hands holding them in his, the way you hold something you intend to keep, and looked at her with everything he didn't have words for. All right, he said quietly. All right, she agreed. Outside, Daniel's voice rose on some point of apparent injustice, and Abby's came back sharp and certain. Normal sounds, the sounds of a household that was imperfectly and stubbornly and entirely against the original odds, becoming something real. The letter from the circuit court arrived 2 weeks later on a bright morning when the first edge of autumn was beginning to show in the way the light hit the upper timber. Aldridge's claim was dismissed in full. The Morgan land was clear. Caleb read it at the table, and then passed it to Clara without comment, and she read it and passed it back, and he folded it and put it in the strong box with the original deed, and closed the lid, and that was the end of Harlan Aldridge. Thomas, when told, said simply, "Good," and went back to his work. But that evening, he came to supper and sat down and said unprompted, "Clara, this is the best bread you've made." The table went quiet for a fraction of a second, the children registering the first name, the unceremonious natural use of it, and then everyone began talking again, and Clara reached for the butter and said, "Thank you, Thomas." And that was that. Ruth caught her eye across the table. Clara gave her the smallest nod. Ruth looked down at her plate, and the corner of her mouth moved and stayed moved. The plans for going to town came up a week later, and it was Caleb who raised it. They needed supplies. The fall list was substantial, and the circuit court ruling needed to be registered properly at the land office in Oakhaven. And it was, he said, time. Clara understood what he meant by time. Not just supplies, not just the land office. He meant it was time for Oakhaven to see what had happened on this mountain, what had been made here, who she was now. She said, "All right, Saturday." The children were told. The response was predictable. Abby immediately began planning what she wanted from the mercantile with the systematic ambition of a general mapping a campaign. Daniel asked if he could ride up front on the wagon. Thomas said he'd drive if his father needed him to. Ruth said she'd prepare a list. Lily said, "I want to come." Everyone stopped. Lily had not been to town since before her mother died. She was 4 years old the last time she'd been to Oakhaven, and she hadn't spoken then. And now she was standing in the middle of the kitchen, looking at Clara with her clear, decided eyes, and stating a preference as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at Lily. "You're coming," she said. Lily nodded satisfied and left the kitchen. The drive down the mountain on Saturday morning had the quality of something significant dressed in ordinary clothes. 2 adults, 5 children, a loaded wagon, a long rutted trail, turning from summer to fall at its edges. Caleb drove. Clara sat beside him. The children were distributed in the wagon bed, Abby narrating the journey for anyone who would listen, Daniel conducting some private investigation of the wagon boards, Thomas sitting straight with his hat pulled low and his father's expression. Ruth reading a book she'd brought with the determination of someone who refuses to let travel interrupt intellectual activity. Lily sat next to Clara on the seat pressed against her side, watching everything. They didn't talk much on the drive. They didn't need to. The comfortable quiet between them had been established over many evenings at the kitchen table, and many cups of coffee that were too strong, and many problems worked through in the lamplight, and it had the texture now of something built, not assumed. At one point, about halfway down, Caleb said, "You ready for this?" Clara considered. "What exactly am I supposed to be ready for?" "People talk," he said. "You know how they talk." "I know how they talk," she agreed. "I grew up in that town, Caleb. I know exactly what they've been saying about me for the last 2 months." She looked at the road ahead. "Let them say it to my face this time." He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Pratt will be at the Mercantile." "I know." I know what she is," Clara said. "It's fine." He glanced at her sideways. She met the glance. And he did something then that she hadn't seen him do in full in daylight undisguised. He smiled. Not the almost, the real thing. Brief and real and completely his. And it changed the whole architecture of his face into something she wanted to look at for a long time. She looked at the road instead, but she kept the image of it filed with everything else she'd collected from this man. The rope knot lesson, and the account books, and the almost smile by lamplight, and his hand over hers, at 4 in the morning. Oakhaven appeared at the end of the valley road in the clear fall-edged morning, and Clara straightened her spine by approximately 1 additional inch and left it there. The wagon pulled into the main street and people noticed. That was the thing about a small town. It was always watching, even when it looked like it wasn't. She could feel the attention before she saw the faces. The slight pause in conversations, the shift of weight, the turned heads. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop in front of the land office first, because business first was always his way. He climbed down. He'd helped her down. He'd been doing this for 2 months on the mountain, offering his hand without ceremony. Just present when she needed it, and she took his hand and stepped down, and they walked into the land office, side by side with Lily's small hand in Clara's free hand, and Thomas following close behind, because Thomas had appointed himself the rear guard of this expedition without being asked. The land office clerk, a small man named Perkins, who had always been precise and somewhat colorless, looked up and registered the document Caleb slid across the counter and processed it with the efficient neutrality of a man who deals in facts. The Aldridge encumbrance was dismissed. The Morgan claim was clear. He stamped it and signed it and handed back the registered copy, and that was the legal business done. Caleb tucked the document into his coat. Clara turned toward the door. Outside, they reconvened with the other children on the boardwalk, and then they walked to the Mercantile, all 7 of them, which Clara understood was probably something Oakhaven had never seen before. Caleb Morgan walking down the main street with his 5 children, and this woman who had been sold to him for a debt 2 months ago, and who was walking like she owned the boards beneath her feet. She didn't own them, but she'd earned the right to stand on them. The Mercantile bell rang when they entered. Mr. Tennyson looked up from behind the counter with the careful expression of a man who has been expecting this visit and has been uncertain which version of it he was going to get. "Mr. Morgan," he said. "Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Morgan," Caleb said. He said it without emphasis, without announcement, simply the correction of a factual error. But it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Tennyson blinked once. "Of course. My apologies. Mrs. Morgan." Clara put her list on the counter. "I'll want everything on this list accurately weighed and fairly priced," she said. "We're going to need to establish a regular account monthly, as Mr. Morgan's been doing, but I'll be managing it going forward." Tennyson looked at the list. "Of course," he said again. She could feel the room. The 2 women by the fabric bolts who had stopped talking. The man near the door who had turned his head. The particular quality of a small town updating its information. She kept her attention on the list. That was when Mrs. Pratt came in from the back. She came in the way she always did, with the specific energy of a woman who considers herself the social weather vane of any room she enters, checking the temperature, identifying the significant facts, preparing her commentary. She saw Caleb first, then the children, then Clara. She stopped. And then she rearranged herself with the practiced agility of a woman who has spent 50 years never being caught without a response. "Well," she said. "Mrs. Morgan." She said it the way you say something you're testing the weight of deciding whether it's something you can use. Clara turned to face her fully. "Mrs. Pratt." "You look well," Mrs. Pratt said. "Mountain life agrees with you, it seems." "It does," Clara said, simply, without qualification or apology. Mrs. Pratt's eyes moved over her, the assessment that had been happening since Clara was old enough to notice it, the measurement of her circumstances and her standing, and whether she fit the shape Mrs. Pratt had decided she should fit. It was a familiar experience. Clara had spent 19 years being measured by this woman. She was done being measured. "I heard about the land business," Mrs. Pratt said. "The Aldridge matter." "It's settled," Clara said. "Fully. As of this morning." "Is that so?" Mrs. Pratt tilted her head with the studied casualness of someone about to deploy information they consider advantageous. "I also heard it was you who found the problem with the survey documents." "I read what was in front of me," Clara said. Mrs. Pratt looked at her with something Clara hadn't seen from her before. Not the satisfaction, not the calculation, but something that might, generously interpreted, have been a form of grudging recognition. "Your mother was sharp that way," she said finally. "I always said so." It was not an apology. Adelaide Pratt was structurally incapable of apology, but it was something. An acknowledgement sideways and partial, dressed up as a compliment to a dead woman, which was also by extension a compliment to the living one. Clara accepted it as such. "Thank you," she said. She was. Mrs. Pratt moved on to the fabric bolts with the air of someone who has concluded the portion of a scene they scripted and is now ready to exit. Clara turned back to the counter. Tennyson was weighing flour with the focused attention of a man being extremely accurate. Abby appeared at Clara's elbow. "Can I have peppermint?" she said with no preamble. "One piece," Clara said. Abby went to the candy jar with the purposeful stride of someone who has received official authorization. Daniel materialized on Clara's other side. "Me too. One piece," Clara said without looking up from the list. Thomas was at the door, leaning against the frame with his hat tipped and his arms crossed, watching the street. Ruth was examining thread with serious intent. Lily had not let go of Clara's hand since they'd entered the mercantile, but she was looking at everything. The jars and the bolts and the tools and the candy, with wide, consuming attention, storing it all in whatever interior archive she kept. Caleb was beside Clara. He had been there the entire time, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, which was where he'd been since they walked through the door, and where she understood he intended to be. He said quietly close to her ear, "You handled that well." "I grew up here," she said equally quietly. "I know the territory." "You know every territory you walk into," he said. "I've noticed." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the counter at the supplies being assembled, but the line of his jaw had that quality she'd cataloged the contained warm entirely. Caleb version of contentment. She looked back at the list. They were almost done. The second significant moment happened outside on the boardwalk when they were loading the wagon. Jim Carver, the rancher from 2 miles down the mountain whose bay horse Thomas had borrowed on the day of the rifle incident, came down the street and stopped when he saw them. He was a solid man in his 50s, weathered with the direct manner of someone who has spent his life dealing in practical facts. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Morgan," he said. "Heard about the Aldridge business. Glad it came out right." "Thank you, Mr. Carver," she said. "Your boy did right by my fence line last month," he said with a glance at Thomas. "Rode over and told me about the section that came down in the summer storm. Didn't have to do that." Thomas, who had been loading a sack of flour into the wagon and was clearly listening to every word, kept loading without turning around. But the back of his neck went slightly red. "He knows what's right," Clara said. Carver nodded. "Good stock," he said, and moved on down the street. Thomas set the flour sack in the wagon. He still didn't turn around. But his posture had shifted, the set of his shoulders, the angle of his head. She recognized it now, this particular Thomas language. He was pleased. Deeply, quietly, thoroughly pleased. And he was not going to let anyone see it. And she was going to let him have the privacy of it. She passed him another sack. He took it. That was all. The last stop was her father's house. She had not planned this as part of the day's business, but when the wagon turned onto the side street and she could see the house, the front porch, the sign for the shop, the window where the lamp always sat, she said, "Stop here a moment." Caleb stopped the wagon. She climbed down. He moved to follow, and she said, "I won't be long, just me." He settled back. He didn't question it. She went up the porch steps and knocked, which she'd never had to do before in her life, and the strangeness of that sat briefly in her chest, and then cleared. Horace Whitmore answered the door in his shirt sleeves, and for a moment he just looked at her, taking in the woman on his porch, who was his daughter, and was not the girl who had left 2 months ago. "Clara," he said. "Papa." He stepped back to let her in. She went. The house was the same. Smaller than she'd been remembering it. Somehow, the rooms contracted the furniture slightly shabbier than she'd recalled. She stood in the front room and looked at the desk where he'd signed the paper and felt something move through her that was complicated and old and not finished being processed. "You look well," her father said. "I am well," she said. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who has been living with what he did and has not found a place to put it. "The land business, I heard it came out right." "It did." "And the children?" "They're fine. They're in the wagon." He went to the window and looked out, and she watched him look at them. 5 children in the wagon bed, Caleb on the seat. Abby already waving at nothing in particular, because Abby would wave at a fence post if it seemed polite. "He treats you right," her father said, still looking out the window. "He treats me as an equal," she said. "That's more than right." Horace Whitmore turned from the window. His face was doing something painful that she wasn't going to look away from, because looking away was a kindness she wasn't in a position to offer yet. "I know what I did," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I'm sorry, Clara. I know that's—" He stopped, started again. "I know it doesn't fix the thing." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She held his gaze. "But I want you to know something. What you did, the way it happened, I would not have chosen it. Not ever. But what came from it?" She stopped and found the words carefully. "What came from it is mine. I built it, and I'm not sorry it exists." Her father looked at her for a long time. His eyes were wet, which she had not seen since her mother's funeral, and she felt the old, complicated love move through her, persistent and painful, and entirely unwilling to be done with him, no matter what he did. "Come to supper sometime," she said. "When you're ready. The children would benefit from knowing their grandfather." He blinked. They're my children now," she said. Simply, without drama. Because it was simply true. "Come to supper." She kissed his cheek. He stood very still while she did it, the way people stand when they're receiving something they don't feel they've earned. Then she walked back out to the porch and down the steps and across the street to the wagon. Caleb looked at her when she climbed up. She looked straight ahead. "All right," he said. "Yes?" she said. He clicked to the horses. They headed back through town, and Clara sat straight on the wagon seat with Lily pressed against her side and Caleb's shoulder solid against hers, and the loaded wagon full of supplies for the winter ahead, and she looked at Oakhaven as they passed through it, the mercantile and the land office and the cooperage, and Mrs. Pratt's house with its tidy fence, and she felt the complete, settled, irrevocable fact of leaving it again. Not the leaving of a girl with no choices, the leaving of a woman who has chosen. A woman came out of the dress shop and looked at the wagon as it passed, and Clara recognized her, a girl she'd gone to school with, married now, 2 children by the hand. The woman looked at Clara, and Clara looked back, and the woman gave a small, uncertain nod. Clara nodded back. Evenly. Without apology. That was all. They were on the mountain road when Thomas said from the wagon bed, "Next time we come to town, I want to go to the land office myself. Look at the maps." "Why?" Caleb said. "Because I want to know exactly what we own," Thomas said. "All the boundary lines, all of it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I'll take you," he said. "Clara could come," Thomas said. "She's better at reading the documents anyway." Another moment of quiet. The kind of quiet that contains something large being handled carefully. Clara said, "I'll come." Thomas settled back in the wagon. Done. Subject closed. Just Thomas delivering a verdict he'd apparently been working toward for 2 months, and had now reached the verdict that she was in some functional and real and Thomas-specific way part of what he was willing to include in the word we. Ruth looked at Clara over Daniel's head. Her expression was Ruth's expression, controlled observant, giving nothing away unnecessarily. But her eyes were warm. Abby was asleep against Daniel's shoulder, which Daniel was tolerating with visible effort and hidden satisfaction. Lily had one hand in Clara's and one hand out in the air, feeling the wind off the mountain, her face tilted up. Caleb drove. The mountain came back into full view as they climbed, enormous and indifferent as it had always been. Pressing close at the edges of the trail, the timber dark and deep, and the summer turning at its edges into something else. Fall was coming. Then winter. A mountain winter, which she had been warned about and which she intended to face the same way she had faced everything on this trail, directly with adequate preparation and without flinching. That evening after supper, after the children were in bed, after the supplies were put away, and the account book updated, and the coffee made too strong as always, because Caleb was constitutionally incapable of making it any other way. They sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and the particular quiet that was theirs, now that had been built evening by evening since the first night she'd opened his account book without asking permission. He put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held on. Outside, the mountain stood. And inside the cabin that Clara Whitmore had walked into as a debt and had made by work and will and the accumulated force of every choice she had refused to surrender into a home. The fire burned, the children slept, and the woman the mountain had tried to break sat at her own table and held her husband's hand in the dark. She had come up that mountain with nothing but herself. It turned out that was enough. It had always been enough. She just needed the mountain to show her.